When my Nana was very young, she was fortunate enough to have been able to meet her great-grandmother. The women in our typically Irish family tend to have their children at a young age, so it's not unusual for one of the older members of our clan to be able to meet their great-grandchildren before they shuffle off their mortal coil. Now, her great-grandmother, my great-great-grandmother, always wore black. She was a scathing but witty old dear, and if she didn't like you, she would say things like, "May the cat eat you and the devil eat the cat." She was also a widow, lost her husband early on in their marriage, and stuck to her vow of perpetual mourning. The experience made her a deeply religious woman, too. I mean, every Irish person has a little of the church in them anyway, but she took her faith very, very seriously after losing her husband, and I think a lot of that is down to the circumstances in which she lost him. You see, my great-great-grandfather was a sailor in the Royal Navy, which wasn't unheard of back then since we were still subjects of the British Empire, and the ship he sailed on was named the HMS Wasp. Early one morning in the year of 1884, the crew of the HMS Wasp were given the task of ferrying a gang of bailiffs and police to this place called Inistrahall, a little island off the coast of Donegal. The police had nasty business to attend to, as on the island, 3 poor families were no longer able to pay rent to the landowner and were due to be kicked out of their houses. When the sailors found out that they were abetting such cruelty, their hearts sank. The HMS Wasp has visited them previously, delivering a few sacks of potatoes when the islands were on the verge of starvation. They knew how hard life was for the poor islanders, who somehow eked out an existence on a rock that's less than half a square mile in size. The way my Nana tells it, it was so early in the morning that the sun hadn't yet risen, but the crew of the Wasp had sailed those waters many times before, and the veil of darkness was no hindrance to them. Yet somehow, the ship managed to collide with some rocks just off of a place called Tory Island. The ship went down fast, with only 6 of the boat's passengers and crew surviving the freezing cold waters. 52 sailors, policemen, and bailiffs drowned that morning, with my great-great-grandfather being one of them. The incident was a huge scandal, and mainly because it emerged that the HMS Wasp had sunk directly within sight of a lighthouse. This meant that, by all accounts, they should have been well aware of their positioning in relation to rocks they knew well were there. So, as you can imagine, a great deal of rumor and mystery shrouded the ship's sinking, and one particular explanation seemed to capture the imaginations of the mainlanders. It was said that the folk who lived on Inistrahall Island had long been isolated from the Irish mainland and viewed mainlanders with contempt and suspicion. Hundreds of years before, Christianity had been slow to make its way over to Inistrahall, and legend speaks of a massacre that occurred there after many of the islanders refused to renounce their old gods. People said that there was still some who lived on the island that worshipped pagan deities, invoking ancient curses and performing blood sacrifices. So, when a ghastly theory emerged that the islanders had used a kind of cursing stone known as a cloc terre to sink the Wasp before it could land bailiffs on the island, people actually believed it. What's worse is that the story then tells of a local priest who heard of such ungodly practices and sailed to Inistrahall. There he located the cloc terre and promptly hurled it into the ocean to cleanse the taint of paganism from the island. The same priest then safely made it back to the mainland where, by some horrible twist of fate, slipped and fell on a walkway one day and drowned in the River Finn. People were absolutely convinced it was the curse of the cloc terre, and my great-great-grandmother was one of them. Until the day she died, she believed something unholy had risen up from the ocean to take her husband away from her. Now obviously I know that's just a silly old story my family tells, despite all my aunties swearing it's the God-honest truth. And I know because I actually did some research into the sinking of the HMS Wasp, but that didn't make what I found any less horrifying. The Royal Navy held an inquiry into the incident and were looking to court-martial the surviving sailors for negligence. Only one of the survivors had been on deck at the time of collision, and this man swore that the lights of the Tory lighthouse went dark not long before they hit the rocks. Since it was a routine journey for the crew, a junior officer was placed at the helm to gain some experience, but was so lacking in that department that he was unable to navigate in the dark, hence the ship hitting those rocks. To me, the idea of the lighthouse going dark is much more feasible than any cursing stone or what have you. But that means that the people of Tory Island colluded with the people of Inistrahal to plunge the ship carrying their tormentors into darkness. The islanders killed 52 men that morning, all to avoid being evicted from their homes. Whether or not you can blame them is another question entirely, and given that I actually lost a relative in the incident, I don't think I can give you an unbiased answer. But the fact remains that 52 people found themselves plunging into the icy waters of the Atlantic Ocean on a freezing winter's morning in complete darkness. Imagine the horror of slowly hearing the cries of your shipmates gradually falling silent until you yourself are taken by hypothermia. You certainly don't need a belief in the supernatural for that tale to give you the shivers. I am now a 72-year-old man. This happened long ago, but I remember it so well. The background was a series of events that placed me in a mountain cabin outside of Frederick, Maryland, circa 1969 or 1970. Just say my life at the time was in disarray. I had dropped out of college, my father had died very badly, and I was alienated. I needed to get my mind right. The opportunity to move to an isolated cabin, to live in contemplation and solitude was welcome. I had some inheritance money to pay for it. To the best of my memory, I was there 8 to 9 months. No TV, but books and radio. I had a library card, and I can't remember if I even had a phone. The story begins when, a month into my stay, a female beagle showed up at my door. She was a lost dog, and I took her in. Never could train her to do anything, but I fed her, and she was a sweet, if not the brightest, dog. A few months in, I began to feel a presence around the isolated cabin. Hard to describe, but I felt like someone was watching. On many occasions, I thought someone might even be looking into my cabin window, watching us. The next phase was the shadowing or following. I knew the folks a half-mile down the lane, woods all around, and would sometimes visit them at night. Something was waiting for me, and followed closely in the woods beside me in the darkness. You could hear it easily, footsteps in the woods, and it picked up its pace as I did. This not only happened to me, but to my younger brother who visited, and to friends, and it spooked them big time. At night, it was out there around the cabin. And here's the funny thing. I was never afraid, never felt threatened. Not at all, at least early on. There was no feeling of malevolence. I spent a good bit of time wandering the vast areas of woodlands around me. There was a state park just up the hill, and the Frederick Municipal Forest went on for mile after mile. The whole of western Maryland was much more country than it is now. None of the development had set in yet. In our hikes, the dog and I, we came across evidence of campsites, recent ones in the woods, traces of fires, old abandoned buildings that had corners that gave shelter and looked slept in, garbage, food and drink, paper, what have you. Perhaps hunters, but much of it did not have the organized feel that you would get from experienced hunters. The last month of my stay there was when things intensified. Maybe he sensed I was preparing to leave. In the mornings, I would find small dead animals at the bottom of the front porch steps. The cabin had a small front porch screened with a light door and 4 wooden steps to the ground. A spotlight would illuminate the long front yard with woods close by either side. Dead animals began to appear at the bottom of the steps many mornings. I remember small birds, then a squirrel, a rabbit, even a weasel one day, like they were offerings. I had to grab them up before the dog ate them, and this went on almost daily for several weeks. One night, very late, I was awoken by some sound. I lay in bed and heard something from the front porch. I hopped up and hit the lights, and I saw that hound dog who never learned to sit or stay, standing at the front door in a perfect pointer position. She was shaking in fear. She never barked, I heard the door slam and footsteps down the steps. I hit the spotlight but saw nothing. I went out. He had been on the porch at my front door, maybe trying to enter. After that, I stayed in at night more and more. The animal offerings got bigger and bigger. Larger birds, a possum, a woodchuck. It really wasn't funny. The final 2 gifts were legs, either from horses or even cows. Big and bloody. One was skinned, dear God. And the second to last day, the dog left me. I could hear her in the woods howling on a trail following a scent. I looked for her in every way I could. Came up in the following weeks, but to no avail. She left as she came. I moved back to Maryland's suburbs of D.C., got an apartment with a friend, got a job and moved on with my life. One day not long after, I picked up the Washington Post and there was an article about recent encounters with the Sykesville monster. It's described as a tall, yeti-like creature, fur-covered, on 2 legs that would pick out a family or person and give them attention. I wasn't the only one. That attention, described in the article, was exactly what had happened to me. Following you at night, looking inside the house, gifts, and so on. I was shocked. If I had turned on that spotlight and seen a Bigfoot or Yeti, I might still be running. But I think I know who it was. Sykesville, Maryland was the location of the Springfield Hospital Center, a large state psychiatric hospital. It was 20 miles or so east of Frederick, and back then, many folks knew how to live in the woods. They grew up that way, country folks. I think the monster was actually an escaped patient, or just a free schizophrenic who lived outside. This is like all the homeless you see in the cities now, probably off his meds, but somehow functional and just lonely. He would pick people or families to adopt, so to speak. The camps in the woods could have been him. Nothing to do, he would make mischief. I think he liked me, but sensed that I was leaving. Now, I can't prove any of this, it's just my theory. My monster was very much of that time and place, and his behavior was what I noticed in nearly every case then. I don't think he could have survived until the 1980s. Deinstitutionalization of mental hospitals threw the mentally ill out into the streets and took away the shelter of hospitals. Unprotected, the mentally ill do die, but once in a while, they find their way to you. I was 19 years old at the time. I had a really good opportunity to go to college, but things fell through a couple of months into it, and basically, I wasn't allowed to go back at that college. I'm not going to go into the details, but I found myself stuck. I was living at home with my parents and working at McDonald's most of the time. I was really disappointed in myself, especially because I didn't have anyone else to blame but myself. I seemed to be your typical college dropout that ended up working at fast food. But while I was working there, I had a couple of really strange experiences. So the first one happened like this. There was this really creepy customer. He was an old man, and he just seemed like the most insane individual ever. You just have to think of the physical embodiment of Florida man. He always wore this bathroom robe with a stained white t-shirt underneath. Or shoes. He had these really old Nikes that seemed like they had been completely covered in mud and never washed. Everywhere he stepped, there was some residue coming off of his shoes. I don't know how far he lived, but this guy came in to eat at McDonald's 4 or 5 times a day for as long as I worked there. I never personally had any horrible experiences with him. It wasn't like he was this unruly customer. He always asked for extra ketchup, but it's not like that was a crime or anything. The story is weird because I remember talking about him with some of my coworkers. I had one friend there that I became rather close with. I remember talking with her about this creepy guy that had just came in to eat McDonald's all the time wearing his pajamas. When you work with the public, there are so many people and faces that you see all the time, and none of them mean anything. It's just another customer. But when you have someone like this, it almost makes the job a little bit more bearable. As weird as that might sound. A little bit more consistency to the job. Plus, making jokes about someone like that was kind of fun. But there was one day when the jokes weren't funny anymore, because he stopped coming in. They couldn't find out why either. I mean, when you see someone multiple times a day, every day for months on end, you get a little surprised when they stop showing up. It all just seemed, I don't know, unusual. I remember talking to my friend about it. Neither of us could imagine why he stopped. I remember getting a phone call at 2 a.m. that night, though. I guess my friend had gotten curious and looked around online. She's a bit of an insomniac. I guess he had been arrested on multiple drug charges. She had found a picture of him in the public database for our county's police department. In the mugshot, he was wearing that exact same bathrobe that we always saw him wearing. That was interesting. Really weird to think that someone I saw and interacted with multiple times a day was an actual dealer. But I guess that was that. My other experience working at McDonald's was really bad. Not going to lie to you, it really freaks me out and really made me question humanity. So it happened like this, right? I was working the graveyard shift. It must have been around 12 a.m. and we didn't have any customers. We already cleaned all the machines as much as we could, and there really wasn't anything to do. We lived in a smaller community, so there weren't too many people coming in to eat at such a late hour. We had a few here and there, but we were mostly just sitting around, particularly slow this night. I remember going over to check the garbage cans for the other side of the store. Occasionally, we would forget to empty that garbage pail. It was directly behind a booth and out of sight from the area we normally worked in. I remember going over there, and there were 2 big bags of garbage that needed to be taken out. They were too heavy to take out at the same time, so I did what any sane person would do. I carried one out at a time. I remember bringing the first one. I threw it into the dumpster, and I remember hurting my back a little when I did it. I went for a little bit of a theatrical throw and really felt it there. I went back into the store to get the second bag of garbage, and I made my way outside. I got about 10 feet away from the dumpster when I saw something that shocked me. I dropped the bag of garbage. I couldn't believe my eyes. There was a mutilated puppy. Its entire snout had been cut off. I wasn't sure if it was alive or not. It wasn't moving or anything. I took a step closer to try to see a little bit more, and I just felt my heart drop into my stomach. It was the most horrifying thing I'd ever seen in person. It was definitely dead. It wasn't leaning up against the dumpster, and it was just a horrifying thing to see. I ran back inside and asked my coworkers what we should do. We decided to call the police, but they didn't really help much. We were really freaked out at who could have possibly done this and why they would put the puppy there of all places. And the part that still freaks me out is that whoever had done this had been waiting for me to go back inside of the building, and in the few seconds before I came back out, put it right next to the dumpster. I figured they must have been watching me. Didn't know what else to think about it, though. Our McDonald's didn't have an outside camera other than the drive-thru, so there was no hope of trying to identify the person that did this. But it still makes me sick to my stomach to think what that person could be like.